Hello and welcome. First, thank you for stopping by. I hope everybody is doing well. So, today we're going to talk about exposure basics in photography. So, the three subjects we're going to cover briefly today are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These are the three things or three settings in your camera that help you create a proper exposure for your image. Now, this can vary greatly depending on what you're trying to capture, how you're trying to capture it, and what look you're going for. So if you're trying to convey motion, you may use a slower shutter speed. If you want something to be, you're trying to have something stand out, you'll use a smaller or a larger opening for your aperture. A smaller number, but a larger opening. And then if you're trying to capture something low light, you see a lot of this in wedding photography where you can't use flash photography during like the ceremony, something like that. You'll use a larger ISO or sensitivity for your sensor. Used to be film. You use a more sensitive film, but as digital age comes about and everybody has digital cameras, you're talking about the sensitivity or the power being applied to your sensor. So first, we're going to start with shutter speed. This is a measurement of time. Each time that you move down, so if you move from 1/250th of a second to 1/25th of a second, this is actually a doubling the amount of time that the sensor is exposed to the light. You can use shutter speed to help convey motion. You'll get blur depending on how fast your subject is moving to how slow or fast your shutter speed is. So if you're using a really fast shutter speed, it's taking a smaller snippet of time, and you won't get as much motion blur as you would with a longer shutter speed. So an example of this is here. This is some water out at Romanos. Shot this at f10 at a half a second with ISO 100. I did this to help convey the motion of the water. So if I would have shot this at 500th of a second, you wouldn't have seen the motion of the water. It would be pretty crisp. You would see that there is water there, but it wouldn't convey any motion. It'd be a very short snippet of time that is just pretty much like a still frame. There wouldn't be any motion or very little. So for this instance, I chose to use a longer shutter speed moving water. With that said, you also can use shutter speed to help with exposure. Now, this was part of a bracketed exposure that I did for an HDR, but you can see starting on the left over here, that's 200th of a second, then 50th of a second, and then 1/13th of a second. You can see how that changes your exposure. So these all have the same ISO, they all have the same f-stop. The only thing that has changed is the shutter speed. So next we're going to talk about aperture. This is actually the intensity or the amount of light that comes through, that is allowed through your lens. So an example of this is f4 or f2.8. So this is a little different than shutter speed, but f4 is actually a smaller opening in your lens than f2.8. Now the concept of doubling is still the same, so f2.8 is double the amount of light entering as f4. So the smaller the number, the larger the opening. Sorry, kind of froze there for a second. The smaller the number, the larger the opening. So it's a little counterintuitive. So f16 is going to be a tiny opening compared to an f2.8. So just remember that. This also affects the depth of field or the background blur of your images. So next up, we'll see kind of an example. So on your left, I have an f2.8 example. On the right is an f8. At the 2.8, you can see, you don't see very much of the background. It's blurred out. It makes the little plant stick out and stand out from the rest of it. The foreground, the background's blurred. You see this a lot in portraiture work. You want your subject to stand out. You don't want a lot of the background. But then over on the right, I'm doing a kind of a landscape scene, and this was shot at f8. Because I wanted to see a whole lot of what is going on in the scene. So that's how you can use depth of field with your aperture. Now, not all lenses are going to go down as, to the f2.2 or f2.8, but some will. Generally, those lenses are going to cost a little bit more. So generally, the kit lens that comes with the camera is usually like a 3.5 to a 5.6. And that is just the aperture, the widest aperture that lens is capable of. And if you see a lens that says 3.5 to 5.6, that usually means that and this usually is a zoom lens. So at its furthest focal length, or its widest focal length, I should say, it'll be a 3.5. But as you zoom in, that is actually going to change down to a 5.6 because there just isn't enough room in the lens to do 3.5 at all focal lengths. That's why, like the Canon L f2.8, 70 to 200, costs as much as it does because there's a lot of glass in there. It has to have a lot of room to keep 2.8 at 70 millimeter and at 200 millimeter. So it has to be big enough. That's why it's heavy. That's why it's big. But it is well worth the money. So next up, we're going to talk about ISO. ISO used to be film speed. Now it is sensitivity on your sensor. And basically, this just changes how much power is given to the sensor for a given number. So ISO 200 is double the amount of power as ISO 100. Now, the higher the number of the ISO, the more grain you're going to get. I have a few examples here. So all of these were shot with the same shutter speed and the same f-stop, but at different ISOs. On the right is the lowest at ISO 100, and then 400, and then 1000. And I'll leave a link to all these images in the description below, so that way you can kind of look and see the examples that I'm using here. But you can see, if you zoom in, you'll be able to see that there's a lot of grain, or it's not as clear as on the ISO 1000 image as it is on the ISO 100 image. Like I said, typically you'll want to use a higher ISO when the light conditions don't favor using flash, or your scene doesn't favor using flash. If you're outside, you're trying to capture stars or something like that, you're not going to be able to use a flash to capture stars. So you'll want to use a longer shutter speed, maybe a little bit higher ISO or lower ISO, just kind of depends. But let's say you're doing portrait photography at dusk. Okay, you don't have a flash. You haven't quite got into flash photography for portraits yet, or off-camera flash. So you're going to have to use your shutter speed, your ISO, and your f-stop or your aperture to get a proper exposure. Now, you don't want to have a lot of motion, so you want to use a faster shutter speed. And you want your subject to stand out, so you're going to use as low a number on your aperture as possible. Depending on your lens, that might be 3.5 or it might be 2.8. Or if you have like the Canon little nifty 50, it's a 1.8. So depending on the lens you have, you'll be able to go down smaller. Let's say you have just a kit lens, so 3.5. So the only option is to raise that ISO. So you raise your ISO to 1,000 to get a proper image, but when you look at it, you'll notice you'll have more grain in your image once you zoom in more. Now you can compensate this in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever application you're using to edit your photos, but you will have a little bit of grain. That just kind of goes with the territory using the higher ISO. Now, there's ways to get around this. I mean, of course, it's going to kind of be dependent on the quality of the sensor, the size of the sensor that's in your camera. Full frame would be a little bit better than APS-C, but that's a whole other subject. It's a whole other video, people. Whole other video. But this gets you close. I hope this has been informative. I hope you learned something. I'm going to try and do more of these little videos, Photography 101, and share the knowledge that I have. So again, if you like the video, please leave a like. Leave me a comment. Is there a particular subject you would like to learn? Something you would like me to cover? Please just let me know. And leave a comment, leave a like. Hopefully you'll subscribe, and we'll keep on going. So I hope you have a great day. Talk to you guys later.